We're so blessed to have two former pastors here with us. They happen to represent some of our Methodist heritage, which is such a gift and a blessing to us. And so I've invited them to just share a few memories and reflections about their time here. You may have been there for those time periods. You may not have been there. But I'd ask you to listen carefully for what is common between the things that both of them say. What strikes you as true about this church that was true yesterday and might be true today and could also be true tomorrow? Will you do that? Okay. Good. So you have bios in the bulletin of each of these men, but they're dear, dear people to me already. And so I'm going to invite Reverend Bob Sweet to step into this pulpit again and to share a few words of reflection. So will you welcome him? Please say we welcome you. Welcome you. We welcome you. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you.
John Parker assured me the glass of water on the right was mine. I check it carefully because Al Yost always threatened to put a goldfish in it. I never could trust the choir in those days. Roe Granger always threatened to fly a paper airplane to go on my landing field. My landing field is no larger, Roe. A word about my haberdashery. You'll notice, I think I'm the only one here with a tie, except for John Rittner, who asked me what I was wearing and said he wouldn't leave me by myself. In spite of John Paul Stevens, the great Supreme Court Justice, I really don't think bow ties look good with robes, and so I always wore a long robe. And so you see the bow tie is a symbol of my retirement. One of my very first memories of the Niantic Community Church is after having sat on the hot seat for the inspection and vote to be called, and the superintendent and bishop had agreed to appoint. Betty and I came to see the church and to walk around and to hear a bit about the community, and Jean McNeil was to be my secretary. And as she took us into the pastor's office, we were chatting and someone came in and headed for what was then the church office down the hall. And she said, "Oh, that's so-and-so, she's part of the family." And I said, thinking maybe someone had just died and it was part of a bereaving family. I said, "And what family?" And she said, "Oh, we refer to the church as a family." And how true that has been. We can all not let this moment go by without giving thanks to God for Ellen Tinkham. That's strange. This often happens to me. The older I get, the worse it gets. Alan Tinkham, as many of you know, was the pastor when the churches united in 1953. And Alan probably did more than any other one person for the Congregationalists and the Methodists to become a united community church. And we give thanks to God for Alan, who cannot be with us today. In 1978, we had a celebration not as grand as this one, but it would happen to be the 25th anniversary of the merger. And we had a great time, and people shared stories and talked about the early days of the merger when the congregation, they would come together for a church supper, and the Congregationalists would say, "That was our church silver." And the Methodists would say, "Those were our dishes." And poor Alan, one of his greatest tasks was getting the treasurer's books out of the hands of the Methodist treasurer. One of the first things that happened after we got here was the Methodists had a huge national campaign to raise money for the black colleges, the Black College Fund. And I thought, gosh, this is a federated church. What do we do about that? Well, whatever our allocation was, we simply made the decision that we would double our goal and split it between the black colleges, predominantly black colleges of both denominations. And that kind of became a pattern for us as we continued our ministry together through the years. And then we had this, well, it wasn't quite clankety old organ, but it had been around since the building was built. And so we knew we had to replace the organ. Well, anybody knows that an electronic organ is a heck of a lot cheaper than a pipe organ. So naturally, the decision would be simple. Well, not quite so simple. We had a church board chair who was an engineer, and he was very sharp with the figures. And he pointed out to us that electronic organs had a life expectancy of 20 to 25 years max. And that by the time we had replaced that organ twice, we would have more than paid for a pipe organ. Well then, there's the answer. And so we have this magnificent organ. And Judy Reel Tomanek has the funny meeting minutes about the discussions around the organ, and a variety of designs that would have, some of which would have put Roe Granger out here instead of behind me. In those years, this church always had a ministry of outreach to the community. And in those years, we made the decision that the community and the world beyond us was at least as important as we were to each other. And so we made the decision that we would set a goal that 50% of our income would go to the wider mission of the church, and that we would spend as much on others as we would spend on ourselves. And I hear from time to time that those words have not been totally forgotten. And I challenge you to continue to look toward that goal. One of the great blessings of our years here, and we were so blessed to be here during the real heyday of the community church's early years, or middle years, I guess. I don't know what years you call them. It was 45 years ago that we came here. That just blew my mind when I put those figures together. But one of the strengths of this church that I heard about in Springfield before I even got here was the incredible youth program that this church had. That they had 25 or 30 kids in the high school youth group and as many in the junior high youth group. Wow, even in those days, that was a huge youth group. And I have to tell you that you as a church family helped to form the faith and the life of our two kids, who are now strong leaders in their own churches. Our son Kenneth out in a church in Glens Falls, New York, and our daughter Bonnie as a leader in the United Methodist Church in North Reading, Massachusetts. those kids were so blessed to have the ministry of two couples in particular. When we first got here, George and Joanne Wood were the leaders of the junior high youth group, and Ed and Mary Lou Traeger were the leaders of the senior high youth group. And don't let me go on. You got to pull? Just pull.
Take away your water.
The church had a tradition before we got here that on Christmas Eve, this great, strong, wonderful youth group led the Christmas Eve service. I was such a traditional Methodist, and that was a midnight service. I just had to have a midnight communion service. And what a dilemma. So I went to Ed and Mary Lou Traeger, and I said, and I told them my dilemma. And Ed said, oh, we can work around that. He said, I'm Norwegian. In my tradition, the night before Christmas Eve, we had what was called Little Christmas Eve. And so was born what became a wonderful tradition in this church 2 nights before Christmas, was the Little Christmas Eve service. And then on Christmas Eve at 11 o'clock, we had communion. If ever this world and this country needed the church to take the lead and to help our young people find their way, that day is today. Amen. We have got to get to our kids. We have got to somehow redeem this country from the mess we're in. And God give us old people the grace to help the young people find the way of the gospel to justice and peace. Stephanie, I have a word of advice for you. I don't know what they taught you in seminary. But 60 years ago, they said to us, you must never form friendships with your congregation. I want to tell you that some of the strongest friendships in our lives were formed here with some of these good people of God. And that is something that Betty and I will cherish as long as we live. And finally, I want to say that 45 years ago, a recently chosen superintendent of schools in Niantic was selected to be the chair of the search committee. And I find that 45 years, he has not lost his skill.
We don't want to get that mixed up. Oh, dear friends, it is so wonderful to be here with you. So many familiar faces, and it's wonderful to see some new faces, too, that I don't know. And many faces that I recognize and can't patch the name with it, so help me out when we greet each other afterwards. When I came here, I realized that I was following in the footsteps of Bob Sweet and Landon Lindsay, Laurie Etter, who'd been here through both of their times, and whose turf this was, And I was coming into a new kind of polity with joint UMC and UCC. And I didn't know what kind of minefield I'd be walking through there. And I found out fairly quickly that there was a minefield. But 11 years later, I was able to leave here in one piece, and much the wiser for it. Bob, I remember one time at our annual conference, Emery Buck, who was in the publishing house of the UMC, was invited to sit in the chair for the bishop. And he said something, that's the only thing I remember from annual conference then. He said, "I feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony." I recognize the opportunity, but I don't know where to begin. Now, I did not see Betty giving the sign to Bob as she said she would last night. But Jen said, "Don't worry about the time." So I won't worry too much about the time, but I'll keep my eye on Evelyn also. The bios that you have in there actually list some of the things that I don't now have to say anything about really, because you know them. The whole disciple program, I would say of everything I did, that was the thing I'm most proud of, getting that disciple program started. And I'm especially happy that people like Carol Donovan stepped in to take over and lead sessions of it themselves. How many of you, I'm just curious, how many of you have been through at least one disciple course? You see, so the rest of you haven't put your hands up. If it's is it still being offered? Yeah, take advantage of it. You'll be glad you did. Habitat for Humanity, the building of the International House was one of the highlights of that. Heifer Project International. How much we miss Bill Wernow. Bill actually contributed an arc in my name to go along with another arc. I think we had, 6 or 7 arcs that we raised the funds for while I was here. And one of the highlights connected with Habitat was when we had Bernice. Do you remember Bernice of Bernice's Goat, who was a student at Connecticut College, and she came here. We had raised some money for Heifer, and she came and did a children's message here. The Wanakee mission trips began during the time that I was here. And I'll just list through a number of things. Not that I'm responsible for them. I had a part in some of them, but you, the people. What's the phrase? Each member a minister? That's what you are and have been. This will always be hometown for our kids, like Bob Sweet. This is where their deepest friendships in childhood were formed, and they maintain those friendships right to this day. Steve is constantly going off to weddings of some of those friends that he made here. We had large confirmation classes. I mean, it was amazing, a dozen or so year after year. I'll tell one story about Rebecca, because some of you will remember Rebecca did not like coming to church. And she would sit somewhere back there. We said, we go to church, that's what we do. But we'll give you a choice. You can go to 9 or 11. And so she went to 11, and she'd sit back there, and she'd stick her tongue out at me. Rebecca ended up teaching K-8 music up in Bartlett, New Hampshire. Said she'd had enough of that. Went down and taught ESL in Mexico. Got too hot down there. Came back, tried a year again, and didn't like it, teaching elementary. And so she's going back to ESL, but here's the funny thing. During the years in the North Conway area, she became a kind of a go-to person for musical needs. And when the keyboard person at the Lutheran Church of the Nativity in North Conway had to be away, they asked Rebecca to be the substitute. Eventually, she became their music director. She became a member of the Lutheran Church. Who would have thought? And the most amazing thing of all is that when they were courting her to become a member, They asked, because their co-pastors were leaving, going somewhere else, does anybody know any guest preachers we might bring in? I could ask my dad. We ended up collaborating in a service. Who would have thought? So that's a major part of what we give thanks for living here in Niantic. We miss so much just being able to walk downtown to everything that we would want. Well, a few other things. You supported my grant for an application for a Lilly grant. And that was one of the great blessings of my life for 3.5 months, to be able to spend other people's money and go to places that were very enriching. Training in community organizing. Alice Mann did a workshop in Florida on raising the roof, church size of congregations. Came back here. That grant paid for her to come here and do a workshop that we invited other area churches to be part of. The prison pups was going on here through Laurie's ministry in the prisons, and every so often an amen would come from a dog in some under some pew. Field ed students, I think it began when I was here. Ray Munsell needed somebody to be a supervisor when she was at Andover Newton. She asked me if I would do it, and that began a process of a series of field ed students. Arlene Tully actually was here for 2 years, and she's now one of our leading pastors in our conference. Of course, the roast beef suppers. They became the turkey suppers as well during the time that we were here. When I had the grilling by the congregation prior to my being welcomed here, I remember one of the questions, all kinds of questions came up, like, what have you been dreaming about lately? And then Bob Frink says, do you like roast beef? United Action, community organizing for the area. Ocean's still a very active part in that. That began when I was here. I think I was president of that. Our Miracle Temple Church is referred to in the bulletin, and that became a wonderful sharing between congregations. One of the things that, and I rubbed some of you fur the wrong way, I know, and there were some conflict times here that we made it through, and I learned from that. But one of the things that did happen, and I gave an incomplete apology to John Rittner last night about when a decision had made when Laurie was leaving. Do we have one pastor or two? No, it was later than that. It wasn't just when Laurie was leaving. It was when Marty was here. Anyway, do we have one pastor or two? And the committee voted to have 2 pastors. I did not think it was the right decision. And I did not go through a very good process, John. I apologize for not consulting with you better. But what that did was to open the door for new staff modeling. This church doesn't really need 2 pastors to do the sacramental functions and all those kinds of things. And you've got wonderful resources now that you have at your disposal. But I didn't handle that conflict well, and I apologize to you for that. So I thank you for your patience with me during these years. In my 3rd year, I thought I may not be here any longer than this, but I ended up being here. I ended up being here 11 years. It's the longest I've lived anywhere in my life, and I will always be thankful for Niantic Community Church and all of the blessings that I've received personally, that you've given to me. And now, Stephanie, you consider, I should say something just about John, too. I really didn't have much chance to be with John, but I appreciated John Nelson's ministry here so much. And I appreciated Paul Althouse's ministry here so much. I came here for his 25th anniversary celebration. And Paul is now not far from us in Maine, so we get to see each other every so often. Anyway, Stephanie, I love your style and your spirit, and you folks are in good hands. You're going to have a great ride with this pastorate. So many blessings to you, many thanks for what has been, to quote Dag Hammarskjöld, for all that has been, thanks for all that will be, yes.
Well, once again, it's hard to follow that. I don't know if this is mine or not. I think I'll just keep it right there. Well, I heard some threads, right? Some things that both of these men were involved with that we still participate in today. Did you? That was incredible, really incredible. So I'm just going to say a few words, I promise. I've got a script, and you can hold me to it. And then we'll go on with our worship. Does that sound good? Okay. I wanted to tell you that one summer I learned how to knit. I honestly didn't think that it could be done because my sister taught me, and she's really, really good, but she's right-handed, and I'm not, right? So we sat together on the couch in a house on a lake, actually much like the parsonage that I'm blessed now to live in. And I learned from her by mirroring, right? That you hold the needles like this. I'm not sure if this is actually still true. You hold the needle like this, and you loop the yarn like that, right? And sometimes when I wasn't getting it, she would literally put her hands on mine and guide me. Now, when you knit, you make mistakes, right? You're learning to knit and you make mistakes. You can't help it. And it usually happens something like this, that you're going along swimmingly, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, all heck breaks loose. The stitches are somehow impossibly tangled and you don't know how it happened, right? So it takes time and practice, but you can also learn how to loosen the yarn, right? And to start over again. And if you make it to the end, in knitting I learned that that's kind of a fuzzy category, that the end is pretty much, I guess, when the sock is finished, or the pot holder, or the scarf, or you can just decide it's the end, right? You can just decide it's the end, and you have yarn for a new project. It really pleases me to think about Jesus Christ as an obsessed knitter. I know, think about it. You are, I can tell. It really does. I think of Jesus as an obsessed knitter. How many of you would consider yourselves knitters, maybe obsessed ones? Right? I have, my sister's kind of an obsessed knitter, and she patrols the yarn store that's nearest her, looking for interesting colors and textures, right? She looks for new patterns to come out. And she, of course, like all crafters, she has a million projects in her closet that someday she might finish, right? It really pleases me to think that Jesus knits socks for the homeless and makes giant colorful sleeves for army tanks. You can actually Google that. That's a real thing. It pleases me to think of Jesus doing that, of keeping his hands busy, knitting for cozy comfort and also for world peace. There's a way to tell the story of a church, especially one that has been around in some form or another for 300 years. There's a way to tell the story of a church where what happens next always seems preordained, right? It was always going to happen exactly the way it happened. These people did this and this and this for these reasons. These pastors did this and this and this, and this is what happened. But that's a story, and stories are lived forward. They're lived forward. In real life, I think we don't so much knit as we are knitted. We don't so much knit as we are knitted. Things happen and we respond. We make mistakes and we can learn from them. Events move us and change us and even transform us, but they rarely happen in the blink of an eye. Instead, the needle moves through us. And the beauty of the thread is often invisible to us And even if we stop and step back to look at the pattern, we often don't recognize the whole picture until we look at the finished product. When I think about this church, and I know I've been here for 10 months, I have a lot to learn still, but when I think about this church, I see some patterns. I heard from these two men, just two of the pastors who have served here, some patterns. That this is a church family, that social justice matters to us, that you have been served by gifted pastors, that you have a love of youth, that you care about outreach, that you consider each member here to be a minister, that you know how to laugh, and that something about this church, it was in what Bob Sweet said, something about this church believes that we should care as much about others, at least as much about others, as we do about ourselves. I see that Jesus has used some brilliant colors to knit this church together. The mere fact that we have so many dear friends with us today to celebrate 300 years of ministry says to me that NCC cannot stop knitting. It's begun a scarf, and scarves are dangerous because you can start and you can just keep on going, right? This is what happens. This is what happens when you keep putting the needles together. So what will God make with us next? Will we be a sock to go with the other sock? Will we be a tea cozy, a hat, a sleeve for an army tank? Something original and daring? I don't know. I don't know. And here's another question. What will we need to loosen in order for something new to take place? Because I believe that Jesus Christ is obsessed. He is an obsessed knitter. So let's do our part, shall we? And let him do with us what he wants. Let him knit. Amen. Amen. I'm going to risk it. We're just milking this as long as we possibly can go. Well, it goes without saying that we are not the same church we were 300 years ago. It goes without saying. But we're also not the church that we were 30 years ago or even 5 years ago. And we don't have to be. The past can be celebrated. The past can be forgiven. Sometimes the past even plays itself in a different key, but it can never be repeated just as it was. For the church today, we give thanks. And for the church of tomorrow, we practice trusting God.